Experience relativity.
Experience relativity.
Experience relativity.
Shout out to the 757 with the clips quote to bring us in. Welcome to another episode of the Experience Relativity podcast. I am your host, Shelton Smith, aka P. Winslow Lee. That's P. Winslow _ Lee. And the podcast can be found at Experience _ Relativity on IG as well. Thank you for exploring the space between us. 2 weeks post marathon and still rocking out these episodes with what I learned doing endurance running. I need you to get wilder. Shout out to Peloton, who established a training program which got me across the finish line. And also big shout out to Saucony, the brand that was on my foot and guided me across the finish line as well. We are exploring the theme Get Wilder from two perspectives, the enthusiast and the indifferent. Regardless of whether you're an enthusiast or indifferent to the race of life is on. And the clock started when you were born. And either you are consciously running a race towards the finish line, living out your dreams, or the finish line is chasing you. Regardless, you two will cross paths. But for the entirety of that race, I need you to understand that it is just you versus you. You versus you. And the title of today's episode is The Grind. So we are grinding. And if you've been tuned into the previous episode, you know what time it is. It is story time. Now, today's story, I want to tell you about my first day at work. It was July 13th, 1983, and it was Norfolk General in Norfolk, Virginia. The end. That's all I know about my first day at work in life. Good story? All right, I'll fill in some details. Now, my first day at work I'm talking about is the day that I was born. And Dr. Ali Benazar or Benazir, I hope I didn't butcher that name, but I apologize if I did. And I'm using your writing as a source of information. So hopefully that makes up for it. From the day that you are born, you probably did the hardest thing that you will ever do in your entire life. And that is, in fact, to be born. Most people don't understand, and as Dr. Ali Benazir put it out there, that the chances of you being born is 1 in 400 trillion. Now, this is not a science-based proposition or, statement. It is loosely based on science and the probability of certain things happening. I believe some of the factors that went into this is the likelihood that your parents would have met, which is 1 in 20,000. The likelihood that your bloodline would exist for 150,000 generations. The fact that, a woman produces numerous eggs and, a woman is born with all of their eggs and those eggs are there, and that one egg that just happened to become you has to be the egg that was released at that time. That during one ejaculation, there are over 100 million sperm. So one sperm fertilizes an egg in most pregnancies. So there's 1 in 100 million. Like these types of ratios or, whatever, like for you to be born, even the number of expressions of gene combinations like that had to produce exactly you from that one sperm and that one egg. Like, come on, man. When we talk about something that is statistically exceptional, you being born was statistically exceptional. It's probably the most statistically exceptional thing that every single human being that was born does. And most people do not even remember their birth. In fact, the people who say they remember their birth, it's highly unlikely. And usually it's just formed memories from stories that you may have heard, and you've created these memories. Like, it's insane that we don't even remember the hardest thing that we do in our entire lives. Like, you can't even form memories. This is due to your brain development. You can't really form memories until you're about 2 years old, somewhere between 2 and 4. And just to throw an extra caveat for those who really like to explore thought, in order for you to have a memory, you must have a sense of self. You must know that you are not just existing as a part of everything you see, but you are something different than all the things that you see. Imagine when a kid walks past a mirror and they realize that the thing in the mirror is not them, it's just a reflection of them. And they are now seeing this meat suit that their experience exists in. They have a body that they have control over. Like, these are mind-blowing things, but you still can't form a memory at that time because you're just now realizing that you are apart from everything else. So arguably the hardest thing you'll ever do, you don't even remember. And that, to me, is where the grind begins. The grind begins there. And we don't even have to get into the physiological parts of being born, but I'm just saying that gotta be some painful stuff to go through if you actually remembered it. But at the end of that story, and at the end of this story for me, is purpose over pain. That's what the grind is about. The grind is there so that you can put a purpose above all the pain that comes from the grind. And just like being born, and just like the amazing and extraordinary women that are afforded the opportunity to give birth, and that feat that they actually accomplish, I just ran a marathon, not comparing that to childbirth, but I just ran a marathon, which was arguably one of the hardest things that I remember doing in my life, but I can barely remember it. And that's crazy to me. Now let's jump into slant one for this episode. And this is going to focus on the grind from the perspective of the indifferent. Like, whether you're indifferent to running this marathon or whether you're indifferent to running a race of life, the grind exists. The grind exists. And if you're indifferent, you kind of see the grind as simply a means to an end. And the real joy or, pleasure in the grind is always after you've completed something. So whether it is the post-climactic clarity when you actually have scaled the mountain and you've gotten there and you get back to the bottom and you're like, oh my God, I did it. And you're just enjoying having done it. or the thrill of victory. Like you set out to do what you had to do, you did it, you won, and now it's the thrill of victory. So the grind is providing that to you. It is just something that you have to do, and you get your pleasure really from being done versus actually going through the process. There is very little pleasure in the process when it comes to being indifferent to what you're doing. When I first started running, and I mentioned this in previous episodes, when I first started running and preparing for this marathon, did I enjoy the runs? Nah, I don't think so. And I did get to a point where I loved running, but I realize now, in looking back, that what I most enjoyed was finishing each run. It wasn't even the actual run itself that I enjoyed. I enjoyed finishing the runs. So I hadn't even gotten to a point where I could enjoy the process. And that is what I believe I was developing to do. So from the indifferent slant, the grind is really just a means to an end, and you get all your pleasure from the ending. You get your pleasure from the completion of the thing, and you don't get it until after. That's one way to look at it. Now let's jump into slant two. If the indifferent is a means to an end, then for the enthusiast, the grind is a means to discovery. What do you mean? What do you mean by a means to discovery? Well, as you are going through the process of preparing, or as you are going through the race of life, it's a means to discovery because the race is happening and you are doing whatever you got to do to prepare and execute on this race. But a lot of this is you looking at yourself and discovering, if I do this, I felt this way. When I did a tempo run, I hated it. What is my actual tempo? Like, what's my marathon pace? How do I know what these two are, and how do I get better at those things? So you're constantly discovering things about yourself. You know what? I like to run and be hot, so I will wear more layers. You know what? I like to run and be cold, so I will wear less. Like, I am not much of a sweater. I am a pig when it comes to sweating. So, like, you finish every run drenched, whatever the case may be. But it's a lot of discovery about yourself. The focus of that grind is not necessarily all the external things, at least not solely the external things. It's also the internal things. Now, there's also environmental discovery, because not only are you learning about the world within as you go through this race, but you are learning about the world outside of you. And again, there's so much to learn. There's so much to discover as you are going through the process of preparing for the race and racing. I mean, I can tell you more actually about what was going on internally during my race than I can tell you about what was going on outside of me during my race, the environmental things. Like, I was so, like, in a deep state of discovery about myself while I was running that I could tell you very little about what was going on outside of me. I did hit every replenishment station. I do remember people cheering my name when they would see my name tag and stuff like that, and they would call that out, and it did keep me going for some point in the race. But there were so few things externally that I remember about the race. One of the dopest things that I think about the grind is I think about the grind from a pretty deep perspective. And this is what I mean about discovery. Because if you are really thinking about if you are really thinking about the grind from the perspective of like just the physical act of actually grinding something, like one thing being, you know, pressed up against something else and kind of eroding something away. Like one of the dopest things that you learn about the grind is that no two things actually ever touch each other. Like that was some mind blowing stuff when I found out that, like, even when you take two fingers and place them together, that these two fingers never actually touch one another on a microscopic scale. Like they never physically make contact. Like the little fields of electrons that are around the atoms that make up, these fingers, they never actually touch one another. It doesn't work like that. So when you're actually grinding things, they're not actually touching. But anyway, that's my science nerd. Like it really, when you start to discover things about the grind itself, whether it's internal or external, you kind of really get into it, and you get an appreciation for things. Like asking the question, and like I said, I may lose you. You know what? If you got to fast forward through this section of the podcast, it's okay. If not, just ride this thought experiment or wave with me. But when I think about the grind, I also think about whether I am the thing that is being ground or whether I am the thing that is doing the grinding. Like that's a whole perspective on life. Like I literally think about it in that way. Like when life gets heavy to me and I'm going through really challenging things, I wonder, which one am I in this moment? Am I doing the grinding or am I being ground down to something? And whatever that something is it making me better? It's like exfoliating your skin. Whatever's grinding me down, is it just taking off a surface layer so that my skin is softer and smoother and healthier? Or is it carnage? But the last example of the grind and just the ideas of exploring and discovering things about the grind is where the rubber meets the road, truthfully. Like, I don't think we think about the fact that when we drive, for example, you have rubber on your tires, and your rubber on your tire is actually meeting the road. And you may think about your tire and walk with me now. When your tires are worn, that's like the only time you think about the fact that your tires started as one thing and are no longer that thing. And then you replace them and then you forget about them again. Your tires, where the rubber meets the road, is actually grinding away at your tires. I did not know this until I became a huge Formula One fan and started finding out about tire degradation. You are laying rubber down on the road as you drive. So your tires are physically leaving a trail, even though you cannot see that trail in most cases, but they are physically leaving a trail of rubber on the ground. That rubber even gets washed away from the asphalt when it rains and ends up on the side of the road. There are whole scientific studies about what is the effect of all of the rubber that gets laid down on the road being washed off into the soil over time. But Anyway, I said all these things to say that there's so many freaking grinds going on, and there's so much to know about these grinds, and there's so much to learn about yourself. That's what I mean by like when you're an enthusiast to the race of life, or when you're an enthusiast to a race of a marathon, there's so much to discover and learn. And it's all about being less transactional in your life and allowing things to be more transformational. Allowing those things and all these discoveries, whether they're environmental discoveries or self discovery, to transform you into the best version of you that you can be in. So, we got the practicality of doing what we got to do, and we have what I like to call the extravagance of life. Now, what happens when that practicality meets the extravagance? And this is the crux of our episode today. When I was running my marathon, I existed in my simplest form. Like, I don't know, like, man, I wish I could put it into words, but I really can't. And I'm sure that's why some people gonna have to run it themselves to find out if you are that curious. But I existed in my simplest form. Man, just I don't even remember thinking about anything more complex than the most basic. Am I breathing? Am I breathing? Am I hurting? You know, is my heart rate good? Like, it was all just the most simple things, like the simplest things. And I was surrounded by grandiosity, like everything that man could create in the time period to emphasize the importance of itself, when in the grand scheme of things it really wasn't that. And that is with all due respect. All due respect. It is with all due respect for the hard work and the innovation that created Rome and all of its beauty and all of its splendor to this day. But it really was, excuse me, it really was nothing at that point. It was beautiful scenery, but it was nothing because I existed in my simplest form. The most practical way that I could get through that race was all that it was about. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. And at the crux of practicality meeting extravagance in life, I think both parties must understand you've already done the statistically hardest thing you will ever do in life. So let's start treating the rest of this stuff as such. Like, yes, running a marathon is hard and you have to train for it, but you were born. So you've done something way harder. Getting a promotion at your job is hard. It's really hard. People got to know you, like you, and trust you. But you know what? You were born. So you've done something probably trillions of times harder than getting a promotion at your job. The grind. The grind is a beautiful thing. And I can't even believe that I'm saying these words, because when I tell you, I used to be a person who, man, I had my feelings. I had my feelings about a lot of things, especially associated with the grind and the systems that facilitate the grind and capitalism and economics and all of these things. Man, I had my feelings. So for today, for me to know so much more about all of the things I mentioned before and not necessarily like any individual thing that I mentioned much more than I did back then. What I've come to understand is that the grind is a beautiful thing, but not in and of itself. The way that the grind wears on people is not in and of itself a beautiful thing. But for all of the beautiful expressions that it is responsible for generating, how we react to the grind, how we master the grind, how we find a way to enjoy our lives with the various grinds that are going on, and we express ourselves beautifully as a result of this grind. Because without this grind, we may never have seen some of the things that we've seen. A good friend of mine that I actually met at the starting point of the marathon, and I do consider this person a good friend of mine now because we had some great conversations on marathon day and continue to have great conversations. They sent me a post, and it was from some comedy movie, and there's a priest like up on the stand, and he's giving this like long monologue. But it was interesting what he said. He said, I prayed for strength and God gave me difficulties so that I could build strength. I prayed for wisdom and God gave me difficult problems to solve. I prayed for courage and God put me in dangerous positions so that I could develop courage. And I prayed for love and God gave me troubled people to help. And I was like, man, that is what I mean when I say that the grind is beautiful. The grind itself, like difficult situations, uh, challenging problems, dangerous situations, and troubled people to help in and of themselves are not beautiful things. This is not something that we would just inherently could consider beautiful. But the things that are developed as a result, strength, wisdom, courage, and love, that's the beauty in the grind. I gotta say that when it comes to the ability to approach the grind from a practical perspective and one of the extravagance, really getting into the details and that appreciation, running a marathon was actually the first time that I truly enjoyed running. Like I said, at one point in time, I realized that I just enjoyed finishing runs. Running a marathon was the first time that I actually enjoyed running. I finish as I always finish with gratitude. Thank you for each and every person that has listened, watched, signed up for a mail list, shared any episode or any of the content that we create as a part of this. We do this to spark curiosity about the experience of others. We do this to support the exploration of the wildest territory on Earth, and that is the space between us. I'm sharing this because I need you to get wilder. We have talked about patience, we've talked about rhythm, we've talked about focus, and we've talked about the grind. And these are all things that I learned while doing endurance running. Man, thank you for exploring the space between us with Experience Relativity. Love you.
Experience relativity.
Experience relativity.
Experience relativity.